We are in a revolution. But it is a revolution in which the side that fires the first shot loses. We will not fire any shots because our weapon is uncommon good sense.
Hello and welcome to Tractor Time. Tractor Time is brought to you by Barn to Door and Acres USA, the voice of eco-agriculture. I'm your host, Ben Trollinger, editor of Acres USA magazine. On this, our 51st episode, we welcome investigative journalist Tom Philpott. Philpott is the food and ag correspondent for Mother Jones. Before that, he covered the food system for Grist. His reporting has appeared in the New York Times, Newsweek, and The Guardian. He's worked as a bona fide farmer and now splits his time between Austin, Texas, and North Carolina. He has a new book out from Bloomsbury Publishing. It's called Perilous Bounty, The Looming Collapse of American Farming and How We Can Prevent It. I'm thrilled to be able to share this conversation with you today, but before we get to that, let's check in with the fine folks at Rodale Institute. Welcome to a monthly segment we're calling Transition Land. It's a collaboration with Rodale Institute, and we're focused on helping conventional farmers transition to regenerative organic practices. On this episode, Christy Wendelberger joins us to talk about the regenerative organic certification standards Rodale helped develop. Christy, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Ben. Thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit about your role at Rodale Institute?
Yeah, I am the director of research at the Southeast Organic Center. We opened up in February of last year, so we're just making our first year anniversary right now. And I started working at Rodale in March of last year. My background is in plant ecology. So I am I'm trained as a plant ecologist, and that means I've done a lot of work studying, well, in this particular case, did a lot of work studying rare species and regeneration niches of rare species. And a lot of my time and research has been spent in the Everglades, working there. And so sometimes people ask, how did you get to Rodale doing agricultural research if you're coming from the Everglades? And the reason is because at heart, I'm a conservation biologist and I really want to conserve the land. I've worked on single species introductions and I've worked my way up through my career in terms of scale. And my previous job, I was doing advocacy work for Everglades restoration. And during that, I realized that most of the problems that are happening in the Everglades, aside from canals, the other half of the issue is farming practices. And it's the way we're farming and putting nutrients into the watershed, which is causing a lot of the problems that are happening in South Florida and around the world today. And so when this opportunity came up to work at Rodale and try to work on figuring out ways to get people to farm better, I saw that as a way to continue my career journey of scaling up in how I'm going to work to protect the environment and protect the earth for everyone.
So this is really about educating farmers on how to change their practices, particularly reducing use of pesticides, herbicides, synthetic fertilizers, things like that.
Exactly. And to get all of that, to get the chemical use down, because a lot of the issues when you look at the Gulf of Mexico and the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, that's caused from nutrient runoff going down through the Mississippi watershed and out into the Gulf. The same thing when you hear about algae blooms in South Florida, and Lake Okeechobee and all the algae blooms happening there. That's because of nutrient runoff from farming, mainly, that's coming out into Lake Okeechobee and then going off out into the coastal areas and causing these unnatural blooms of algae. And so we can help that by fixing our farm practices and working more sustainably and doing more organic and regenerative agriculture.
What are the first steps that you usually prescribe to farmers who are looking at changing their practices to be more organic or regenerative?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on where they're at. In order to move forward with any kind of change, you have to start with just where you are. And so some farmers are already doing things like cover cropping. Cover cropping is really important. You don't want to leave the soil bare for large periods of time. That causes all sorts of things to happen. It can cause runoff if there's a big rain. There can be erosion if it allows for off-gassing of carbon dioxide and nitrogen, and changes in the microbial community in the soil that really can help. If there's cover crops, it can really help the soil perform better for your crop in the future, and provide more yield for your crop in the future.
So keeping roots in the soil.
Roots in the soil. That's really important. Yes, absolutely.
Well, so talk a little bit about definitions. So people have an idea of what organic is. It's what you don't use. You don't use pesticides. You don't use herbicides. And then the latest term is regenerative. A lot of our listeners may know what that is, or think that they do. How do you define it when you're talking to conventional farmers, let's say? How do you explain the concept of regenerative organic agriculture?
Well, regenerative agriculture, a lot of conventional farmers are using regenerative agriculture. Regenerative means no-till, means cover cropping. A lot of people are already doing that. It's a way to, like I said, a way to protect your soil microbial level, a way to protect your soil during major rain events when you don't have a crop on the land. The difference is that when you are regenerative organic, then you are taking it another step farther. You're not just cover cropping. You're not just no-till. You also, instead of cover cropping and then killing your cover crop with an herbicide, you cover crop and then you roll your cover crop down with a roller crimper, for example, or you flail mow it and you leave it down as a compost layer. Regenerative organic farmers are not using chemicals. They're not using the pesticides, the herbicides. It's going back to that story of the Everglades. It's the way to keep the nutrient levels stable in the soil and really have healthy soil that then can lead to healthier plants and then healthier people that are eating that food.
So Rodale has a regenerative organic certification process. Talk a little bit about that. What does it take? What are sort of the benchmarks? What are the boxes that you have to check in order to get that certification? I think that might be kind of interesting for farmers who are looking to get into something like that in terms of their practices, to know what that list of things might be.
So regenerative organic certification is overseen by the Regenerative Organic Alliance. Rodale is a part of that. There's lots of organizations that are a part of it. Dr. Bronner's Patagonia, Compassion, and World Farming. There's several other organizations that are involved. And the idea to regenerative organic certification is to use the USDA sort of certification process as a baseline. That's great, right? USDA is there, USDA certification is there, and it's awesome that it exists. And we know that when you eat your foods from there, they're going to be pesticide free and herbicide free. But what regenerative organic does is take it another step further. So it really shows that the farmer is doing regenerative practices. You can be organic and not do regenerative practices. And so part of the process is to spend the first 1 to 3 years, improving your soils in the way that you do during the organic certification, getting them up to that level so that you're really maintaining the soils. There's three pillars in regenerative organic certification. There's soil health, animal welfare, and social fairness. So the next step after you've got your soils going and things and you're doing practices in a regenerative way, then it's animal welfare. If you have animals on your property, how are you keeping them? Are they free from harm, free from disease? Are they on pasture? Are they in a really cramped environment where they're uncomfortable, or do you have them free where they can actually behave the way animals that species would behave in the wild, right? Can they roam? Do they have some space? And then there's also the social fairness aspect. Farming is not, it's hard to get the money that you put into your farm back from your produce. And so it's understandable when farmers are trying to find ways to save money. But if you're, the whole point to regenerative organic certification is you're paying your workers fairly. There's transparency in the process of in the employment process. There's no forced labor, that it's just a healthy, safe work environment. And the idea is that when you get this label and you get this regenerative organic certification, then it will help you be able to increase the value of your product so that you get your money back for these extra efforts and you get recognized as doing these extra efforts. And then the consumer, when they're buying the food, can say, can know within themselves that their food is coming from a place that's treating the land well, that's restoring their soils, that's treating the animals on their property well, and that's treating their employees well as well. So it's coming from a holistically healthy environment.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Christy. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Christy Wendelberger is the research director for the Rodale Institute Southwest Organic Center in Chattahoochee Hills, Georgia. She's responsible for expanding organic farming practices throughout the Southeast through research, outreach, and education. Learn more about her work in Georgia at rodaleinstitute.org/Southeast Organic Center. I want to take this moment to introduce our new sponsor, Barn to Door. They're doing a new segment aimed at helping farmers, and you'll hear that later in this episode. But who are they? Barn to Door powers farmers who sell direct, helping them increase sales, access customers, and save time. They help farmers meet buyers' expectations through easy ordering and an accessible brand across all online channels. Farmers use software, services, and resources from Barn to Door to manage and promote their business. The bottom line is this: farmers that provide convenient buying and delivery options reach more buyers. Data shows farmers can double revenue when they offer online subscriptions and direct delivery. Promote your brand, manage your orders, and keep your profits with Barn to Door, providing the capabilities and support you need to build a thriving farm direct business. Learn more at barntodor.com/Tractor Time. Okay, Tom Philpott. There's so many books now on the shelf that indict our broken food system, but Philpott's new book is the culmination of an impressive career spent holding industry and government accountable. Perilous Journey tells the story of two U.S. farming powerhouses, California's Central Valley and the Corn Belt of the Midwest. Through this lens, Philpott makes the case that current agricultural practices and policies are leading us down the road to environmental ruin. And yet, there's still hope on the horizon. I hope you find this conversation as insightful as I did. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
There are countless books written on our dysfunctional food system, but your book takes an interesting angle on this subject. You focus in on two major agricultural regions, the Central Valley in California and the Corn Belt in the Midwest. Can you explain why you chose those two areas and what they tell us about modern industrial agriculture?
Yeah, so I chose them, I started writing about this topic around 2005. I was working on a small farm in the mountains of North Carolina. Actually, an Acres reader from that time. I found it in a health food store in Asheville. I was a couple of hours away from Asheville, but we would go there every once in a while. And when you start writing about the U.S. food system as a whole, you tend to gravitate toward these two areas because, basically most of the fruits and vegetables that Americans find in the supermarket or get at fast food establishments or even just, regular independent restaurants come from California if they're not imported. If they're domestically grown, the majority of them come from California. And, in the winter, tomatoes come from Florida. And there are definitely other places that have important roles in the food system. But California is a dominant supplier of fruits and vegetables in the United States. And, also obviously nuts like pistachios and almonds that we're getting more and more used to having on a regular basis. All of that comes from California. And then with the Midwest, obviously the corn and soybeans, that production of those commodities is centered in the Midwest. And those are the main building blocks of the meat that we all consume. That when we go to the grocery store, look at this, supermarket case, the meat section is dominated by meat that was raised on corn and soybeans from the Midwest. And so I'm, over the years, writing a lot about these two areas, and long about 2013, in the middle of the California drought, I start to dive deep into the water politics and ecology of California. And I see that there are some real major long-term problems of, essentially agriculture had gotten so big there that it was overstripping California's water resources. And right when I was coming to that realization, there were these big storms in the Midwest. And I happened to be doing a story there at the time. And I realized that these big spring storms that are related to climate change that are ever increasing in the Midwest are really doing a number on that region's soil. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking, well, and then, I dig into it and I find pretty quickly evidence of erosion happening in the Midwest way greater than what the USDA is counting. And so I'm thinking to myself, these are the two crucial nodes of our food system, and both of them are in a state of ecological decline that is accelerating. And it seemed to me a pretty important thing to put together and discuss.
Well, describe these two places as ecosystems, particularly before colonial expansion.
Yeah, so both of them are really unique ecosystems on the planet, or nearly unique. They're very rare ecosystems on the planet, I should say. So California has got this, probably the biggest Mediterranean-style climate in the world, and that's actually a technical term that means on the edge of a continent in a place that on the sunny side, so it could be in the southern hemisphere or the northern hemisphere, but the sunnier toward the equator side, that gets a lot of weather from deep into the ocean hitting up against it as the edge of a big landmass. And Mediterranean climates tend to be characterized by very, very long and warm summers and pretty mild winters. And California's got this other thing about it is it's got this mountain range called the Sierra Nevadas that actually capture this weather, which originates in the South Pacific. In the right months, it essentially serves as sort of a dead end for the weather. So these storms hit up against the mountains and drop in the form of snow. And so it's got this combination of a Mediterranean climate, which actually means long, dry summers, so not very much precipitation in the summer months. And yet this incredible resource of this snowpack that comes. And in the sort of pre-contact times, and actually, we shouldn't even say pre-contact, until the American state took over California in the middle of the 19th century, basically that snowpack ran down the mountain every spring in a way that was pretty unimpeded. There were no major dam projects or attempts to sort of, capture this water. And so what you got in the Central Valley were these incredibly massive rivers, most of which ended up running out into the sea through the Bay Delta. But, a couple of them ran into Tulare Lake, which was the biggest lake. This is in the southern Central Valley, the biggest lake west of the Mississippi in the United States. And so along with these rivers running through, creating, these, in some cases, giant lakes, you also had a lot of water percolating down from this. And that gave rise to this incredible aquifer. And something else that I think that is hard for people to imagine today who go through the Central Valley, which looks like a desert interrupted by agriculture. So you see these really green fields that are being irrigated, and anywhere in between the fields in the summertime, it's bone dry. And it can be shocking to know that there were massive amounts of wetlands in the area that, just had this incredible diversity of wildlife, flora and fauna. And so of course, people lived there as well. There were, lots and lots of indigenous people living in the Central Valley. A lot of people in that time would move from the Central Valley into coastal areas depending on weather patterns. There's a lot of movement back and forth, but sort of people coexisted with this ecosystem, directed it, managed it, but in a way that kept it flourishing. And it would be utterly unrecognizable today to someone, if you took someone from the 18th century or even the early 19th century and plunked them down into the modern Central Valley, it would be unrecognizable because, basically Lake Tulare has vanished. It is now literally almond and cotton fields. That water, gets diverted before it ever, hits the mountain, the valley floor and sent through various dams and aqueducts to go to farming. The wetlands are maybe 5% of the original wetlands still exist. They've all been essentially drained for agriculture. And then in the Midwest and the Corn Belt, also a very unique ecosystem. One of the globe's biggest prairie-derived ecosystems, one of the globe's biggest grasslands. Also, an incredible the way, first of all, the way that and I think your listeners will know a lot of this, but the way that the ecosystem worked up there, it was like a machine for creating soil. So you get these perennial prairie grasses, dropping roots deep into the ground. You had huge herds of bison coming over and, basically mowing them and recycling nutrients. Once again, indigenous people lived there, sort of managed the process, became part of the process, would do burns that would, help keep the grassland from becoming taken over by forests. Also, you had this incredible wonderland of wetlands. And this is because of, large annual amounts of rainfall. And once again, all of that has been essentially plowed up. It would be completely unrecognizable. The wetlands have been drained and planted in corn and soybeans. And an engine of biodiversity. These wetlands were for North American birds, or for this entire hemisphere's birds, they were this incredible engine of nurseries and habitat, food source. All of that has been essentially paved over, and someone who takes someone from 1830 and put them in the modern Corn Belt, and it's an entirely different world. I mean, you're talking about makeovers as intense as going from, this little island off of the East Coast, turning into Manhattan. It's that much of a transformation.
And these ecosystems have been transformed into these agricultural juggernauts, but really at this point, they're extremely fragile. They're very precarious. They're headed toward, as you say in the book, collapse. Talk about that and how that's been playing out.
In the Central Valley, so you've got these two incredible sources of water. You've got the Sierra Nevada snowpack and then these aquifers under the Central Valley that, in a lot of senses, and I think talking to an audience that knows farming, you can see what an agricultural paradise it is, because if you have a long, very warm summer that's very dry, then your pest pressures are a lot lower. There's a lot less danger of mold, and there's a lot less insect life because there's less water feeding that sort of food chain. And if you can push a button and get irrigation on top of that, so you've got all this photosynthesis, you got all this sunlight, you've got no rain, hitting leaves and giving a place for mold to grow, but you can still irrigate, and you can do it fairly precisely with modern irrigation systems, then you've got a great place to grow fruits and vegetables and nuts. But the problem is that this sort of capitalist agriculture, this sort of globalized, this idea of feeding the world, of growing for a global market, of, basically telling the rest of the United States, don't worry too much about fruit and vegetable production. We've got it. We've got this incredible abundance coming out of California. What it's given rise to is more demand for water than the system can supply. And what you would want, and the way that you could really manage a resource like that would be to think of the aquifer as a bank account and live off of the annual snowpack. But to get you through hard times, you could tap the aquifer, and then it would replenish in wet years. But what's happened is we've seen over the course of the 21st century, the last 2 or 3 decades, we've seen a marked decline in the snowpack because of climate change. And so the snowpack is shrinking on average, but at the same time, water demand is going up. And so agriculture in that region is using the aquifer not as a rainy, a dry day bank account, let's say, but they're using it as just an annual resource. And so what you get is essentially a race to the bottom of the aquifer. And until 2015, the aquifers were completely unregulated. So if we're neighbors and I've got, 5,000 acres of almonds and you've got, a 100-acre fruit vegetable farm, diversified farm with maybe some livestock, I am going to have a much bigger well than you are. And when the next drought hits, I'm already using more water than I'm getting from my annual allotment of snowmelt water. And so when the big drought hits and you need to tap that water, I will probably have taken the water level down below what your well can get. And so what you get in the area is this essentially this arms race of well digging, and only the bigger operations can win that race. And so essentially what we're seeing is a catastrophic drawdown of the aquifer. And as you get lower and lower into it, you get more and more salt buildup. The water that comes out is there's higher salt concentrations. There's higher concentrations of naturally occurring chemicals like arsenic. And you're already seeing salinification happening in the Central Valley because the water is getting more and more salty. And we've had a couple of since the drought ended in 2016, we've had some pretty decent years, but still below long-term averages. We're still overtapping the aquifer. And actually, this 2015 law has ordered every one of these watersheds to come into balance. In other words, you can't keep drawing down the aquifer. By 2040, you've got to show that you're in balance. And that is, by all accounts, going to cause a big change in California agriculture, because there are going to have to be hundreds of thousands of acres go fallow. People are going to have to cut back. And the projections are not, so there's this up there, climate projections are telling us that if climate change continues, we could see essentially a zero average snowpack by the middle of the 21st century. And so, we're looking at severe changes coming our way, but farms in the region continue to draw down the aquifer.
Yeah, and you detail in the book the town of Alpa. Am I saying that right?
Yes.
Alpa, California.
Yep.
And people there, and this is just one example. I mean, this is going on across the state, but it's a small town of farm workers, and they don't have access to clean drinking water. It's really just sort of Flint, Michigan, just spread out across the state. Talk about these farm workers who are being disenfranchised from access to drinking water by the very companies that they're working for.
Yeah, so I went out to Alpa, which is a small farm worker community in the southern Central Valley called the San Joaquin Valley, at the height of the drought, probably 2014. And it was really interesting time to be there because of the drought. And when I say drought, I mean what was happening in California in those years was essentially a zero snowpack. Like basically the winter storms that they count on to, fill the snowpack didn't come. And so farms were cut off from surface water, and the entire Central Valley was going on groundwater, maybe a little bit of marginal amount of saved surface water from past years. But getting in 2014, 2015, that's pretty much dried up. And you're essentially, the whole machine is based on pumping aquifers. And so there were these draconian laws and necessary laws put into place for people, for residents of California on, don't water your lawn, cut back on all necessary water. But there were no restrictions placed on agriculture. And agriculture actually uses 80% of the developed water in the state. And so agriculture is a big user, but all the onus went on individuals. And it gets really ridiculous in a town like Alpa because you've got, the average income there is around $20,000 per family, essentially people living in poverty, working as farm workers. And their water supply that we were, at this point, they had two wells. One of the wells had gone dry. And the other well was it was pretty deep, but the water down there was just packed with arsenic. There was, it's not that agrochemicals were poisoning it. It's naturally occurring chemical that it gets more concentrated as you get down. Yeah. So they were well over the EPA limit of what you can have for arsenic. And so the people in the town were forced to buy bottled water, which last time I checked a year or so ago, they still were. They still had arsenic levels that were too high. And because of these restrictions on people, I saw in that town people with really modest houses with a couple of fruit trees outside their houses, where the fruit trees are drooping because it is literally against the law to water them. So these are low-income people, low food security, not a whole lot of availability of fresh foods. And they're being told by law enforcement that they can't water their trees. And it was quite stark to go. I was driving with the guy who was managing the water system. He took me out, less than a mile outside of the town limit to this vast, amazing, essentially, as far as the eye can see, pistachio grove that was being put in. And they were putting in the pistachios, and, in some parts of the field, they were putting in new saplings. In other parts of the field, they were installing the irrigation system. And then in other parts, we saw a crew deepening a well. And all of this was completely unrestricted, use as much water as you want. Whereas the people in the town are literally paying for poison water, having to buy bottled water, and can't water their trees. And, there is a question like, why were they planting pistachios and not almonds? And the answer to that question is the water in that area, the aquifer is so low that the water is too salty for almonds, and pistachios have a higher salt tolerance than almonds do. And so they have this groundwater law now that region, which I should say is at the base of Tulare Lake. It's like right in the middle of this giant lake that has been vanished for almost a century. So this pistachio, so we have this groundwater law coming in that's going to force all these regions to go into compliance. But I witnessed a pistachio grove going in an aquifer that was way out of whack, that was causing all kinds of problems. And what I was looking at was an investment of many, many millions of dollars. And it was a bet on them, whoever that investor was, being able to make lots of money off of that investment, requiring endless amounts of water every year. And that is going to cause some serious conflicts going into this groundwater law when it kicks in 2040. And I can tell you that there are many almond, since I wrote that, almond and pistachio plantings have not stopped growing. And so you're talking about people making investments that require annual access to water. And so, obviously, if you're growing perennial crops, if you're growing annual crops and there's a bad water year, you can take the year off. You can go fallow. You can probably get some insurance money for it. But if you've got millions of dollars invested in pistachio groves, then you can't do that. And you keep hitting that aquifer every year. And we are in a race to the bottom there.
We're going to hit pause on this interview for a brief segment from our sponsor, Barn to Door.
Hey, this is Sebastian from Barn to Door. We're excited to be sharing a new series of Farmer Spotlights during the Tractor Time podcast and segments like these. In today's Farmer Spotlight, we have Ashley Clark from Sacred Roots Maple in New York. We asked her what motivated her to grow their farm's business online, and here's what she had to say.
I absolutely love being a part of the online community because you can meet so many great people and hear their stories. And I think that's the part that I really feel is what connects people to farming. I think that there's this huge disconnect often, but once people can connect with a family or a group of people and hear their story, they feel like they're also part of the experience and the process too. So yeah, people aren't necessarily coming out and tapping our trees and making the maple syrup, but they can get to know us by visiting us or reading about us online, and they feel like they're part of the connection. So maybe when they order a thing of maple syrup and it's sitting on their table for breakfast, they're able to talk about, hey, like this is from upstate New York and this is how they boiled this to make this, and it gains more of an appreciation. And I think that's something that we really find valuable when we're looking for farms to connect with or buying our meat or other products locally. We try to really hear that story so that we can support that group or that family and continue that process.
If you want to hear more about Ashley's story, go to barntodor.com/tractortime. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, one farmer you introduced in the book is Joe Del Bosque. He grows melons and almonds in California, and he seems like a highly competent and successful farmer. But yet he's hamstrung by all these sort of forces beyond his control. You write that he has a thriving business built on shaky ground. What does his story tell us about how actual farmers fit into this industrialized system?
Yeah, so he's a really interesting guy. He's a son of a farm worker who scraped and saved, and got his father, became a farm manager, and he scraped and saved in the 80s farm crisis and was able to come up with enough money to buy land at rock bottom prices when land prices fell in the 80s, and has become a landowner of a couple thousand acres. And so he's got this business where he grows these heirloom organic melons that are essentially sold at Whole Foods. They're very, very seasonal. You can only get them, I think, in the late summer months. And they're, he's got enough to distribute them nationwide through Whole Foods. And these are a very labor intensive product because the sort of modern melons that we get, they can be machine harvested. So you can, these are the sort of flavorless melons you get at the hotel,
right?
Buffet table in the morning. But his melons are really delicate and they're delicious and they require hand labor. And so he's got was out there when he had crews of workers picking the melons, and it's extremely skilled work because the melons don't all ripen at the same time. And it takes skill to know, pick this one, leave that one there. So he's got this skilled workforce and he gets a good premium on them and it's all working out pretty well. But essentially he is counting for his profitability on some really awful labor laws. Basically a lot of the labor protections that most Americans enjoy, like minimum wage, like the 40-hour work week, time and a half overtime that came about in the New Deal, do not apply at the national level to farm workers. And California has been slowly bringing farm workers into essentially the 1940s by giving them these protections. And the final one is time and a half overtime, which I think kicks in this year, 2021. Mm-hmm. And when I was out there in 2019, what he was telling me was that, look, when we're in the growing season and the harvesting season, we have crews working 60-hour weeks because we need to get that product up and out. And if we don't, then, you've got melons getting overripe in the field and they're worthless. And so it's a very labor intensive process in that time. And if we have to pay everyone time and a half, our profit's gone, and it doesn't make any sense for us to continue this business. And so he's thinking about expanding his almond orchards, but his almond orchards are also in a pinch because, he's also a really good grower. He gets a good harvest. He gets a good price on his almonds, but he's in an area that he doesn't have great water rights to these, to the sort of surface water coming off the Sierra Nevada. And so he's got to buy water on the open market a lot of the times. And the aquifer under him is already dry. It's already, or the water is so low quality that it can't be used to irrigate crops. And so his almond business, as surface water declines, as the Sierra Nevada snowpack declines, he's not going to be able, he's worried about having water to feed his current almond groves. And he doesn't think he can handle expanding his groves because he doesn't think there's going to be enough water in the future. And so he's feeling, when I talked to him in 2019, he was feeling pretty hemmed in by these circumstances. Like, right now, I've got a successful business. I'm making profits. I've got a kid who wants to take over the business, but where's it going to go? And he was explaining a lot to me about how anything that's hand labor in California is already moving down to Mexico, because when you cross the border, you get a lot of the same growing conditions and unfortunately a lot of the same water conditions, but labor has a lot less power in Mexico. And so people are paid less. And I think it was his asparagus crop, I think it was asparagus that he used to have a foothold as an asparagus grower, but he's decided that it's too labor intensive. And so he's already shifted out of asparagus. And he says that asparagus has declined in the Central Valley and exploded in Mexico. And I just want to make clear, I'm making an argument that California shouldn't include farm workers in modern labor protections. What I am making an argument for is that these labor protections should be universal, and that Mexican, basically there should be social movements to make sure that Mexican laborers are taken care of as well. But it is a factor in what is, it actually is driving more almond and pistachio expansion, because there are very few crops as mechanized as almond and pistachios. The planting is very capital intensive. It's basically machines that do it. The harvest is these big shakers. Like, one guy can harvest many, many hundreds of acres in a single day in one of these shaker machines. It requires some pruning, which is hand labor, but very, very capital intensive operation. And so California's labor laws are one of the things driving this push to almonds and pistachios, but it's a dead end because of the water situation.
I wanted to take a step back for a minute and talk about your past and present as a journalist. How did you start reporting on conventional agriculture, industrial agriculture, our food system? When did that start for you? What was the entry point? And I bring this up because I think it'd be a good way for us to ease into the conversation about sort of the sources of power and these cartels and oligopolies that dominate agriculture in our country and globally.
Yeah, so I had been a financial journalist living in New York City, and was really into food, and was in a community garden in Brooklyn. And in my day job, I was sort of there to learn about how capitalism works and how financial capitalism works and corporate capitalism. But I wasn't really into the job as a sort of calling. And meanwhile, I'm getting more and more into food and food politics, and sort of got swept up into, there was a push by then Mayor Giuliani, who's taken some interesting turns in recent years. But back then Giuliani was also a fairly dreadful human being, and was trying to crush New York City's community gardens. So I got caught up in this movement to preserve them. And I just started asking a lot of questions about the food system at that time and who's got power in the food system. And, the driving force for Giuliani was basically his real estate cronies. It later came out. And so that was sort of my crash course into food politics. And my long-term girlfriend, still my girlfriend, her family had a farm in North Carolina, and there was a change in her parents' relationship. And, basically it seemed like they were going to have to sell the farm. And we decided to move down with some other friends and take it over and start farming and sort of put my money where my mouth is. This is what I'm really into. Let's dive into it. So I left this career in financial journalism and did that. But in that time, I developed a ability to write daily, and I knew how I had been covering the stock market. And so I knew how to sort of look at corporations and their business models and how they functioned and how Wall Street analysts saw them. And I get to the farm, throw myself into farming. We also did farm dinners where we would take our produce and meat grown by nearby farmers and cook it up and, serve people kind of a pop-up restaurant in the farmhouse. And writing on a daily basis was sort of this missing limb. And meanwhile, I'm reading more, reading my sort of Wendelberger, Michael Pollan. This is before Omnivore's Dilemma, but I'm, reading his previous articles. And I started a blog. I said, you know what? I've got some things to say about this. I'm thinking about this. I'm covering it. So in 2005, I started a blog called Bitter Greens Journal. And it was named that because our sort of flagship produce was salad greens, like spicy salad greens. And immediately I started writing about industrial ag. I started writing about sort of analyzing what Monsanto was up to at the time and what other big companies like Archer Daniels Midland were up to. And so I was applying my skills as a financial journalist with a critique of the food system developed as a community gardener from the perspective of someone who was trying to scratch out a living farming. And so that's kind of how it all started.
Back in 2016, you visited Monsanto's headquarters. I think this was just before the Bayer acquisition. What did you learn there about corporate power?
What I learned there, I think, in the end, as I think back on it, was just sort of a case study in corporate cynicism of, the ability to sort of change your message according to both audience and circumstance. I mean, I think by the time I got there in 2016, the period when the the biotechnology industry could say, hey, trust us because we've got all these wonder seeds coming. We've got these, more nutritious crops, disease tolerant crops, these crops that are going to reduce pesticide use. That fiction was already unraveling. And I think that they figured that the herbicide tolerance problem that they had launched, the widespread resistance to Roundup herbicide, they realized that their solution to it by adding dicamba or 2,4-D to the mix was going to cause lots and lots of problems. And so they kind of backed off of that. And they also, I think they also realized that they weren't going to be coming up with, corn that could sequester its own nitrogen, or, these crops that they had been babbling about for a couple of decades weren't coming into being because the genome of a plant is super complicated. And the way that a plant takes up nitrogen or takes up water isn't one gene or 2 genes or 10 genes. It's many, many genes. And, like you can't take a gene from a cactus and put it into corn and make corn not need that much water. By the time you've tweaked everything and worked everything out, you've recreated cactus. And I think they were coming to that realization. And so I got this story from Robert Fraley, who's one of the sort of innovators of GMO technology. He was the chief technology officer of Monsanto for decades. I think from it started as an agricultural company to the bitter end. I get the story from him. Oh yeah, we use GMOs. we use GMO technology for a couple of things, but really it's not that useful to us. What we really are is a classical breeding company. That's really what our bread and butter is we do high-tech classical breeding, marker-assisted breeding, but it's not GMOs. And that was the story I got. And the ultimate, I think, sort of the punchline to my visit there was, we're going around to each of the different, we're in the research facility outside of St. Louis, and we're going around to each of the departments and getting their spiel about, the awesome stuff they're doing. And then we go into the soil microbiology department. And this department is going to be, generating soil microbes that are going to revolutionize farming. And so we go in there and I start hearing from the chief scientist in the area, and he literally sounds like he could be reading an article from Acres magazine about the importance of soil biota and how, soil is teeming. And did you know there's 1 trillion, living beings in a handful of soil, and how important they are to recycling nutrients and feeding plants. And it's this symbiotic relationship. And so I'm just getting this whole spiel from him. And I'm starting to, kind of get a little bored, and, my mind is wandering. And I look over to the wall, and at the wall, they have these cases that are sort of these sort of glass cases showing their latest and greatest products and with a little information about them. And I'm looking at this product that they're selling to farmers as a soil supplement to put on corn. And it's got this, soil bacteria name on it. And I'm looking at the ingredients, and the second ingredient is a fungicide. And it happened to be a fungicide that I had just been writing about the week before that is becoming ubiquitous in the Corn Belt. It doesn't seem to do that much to increase yield. And it was showing potential to be a brain damaging chemical. And here it is on this sort of magic dust they're selling to farmers that includes, basically like soil microbes that are supposed to improve their soil. And so I said to the guy, hey, so can you tell me a little bit about the soil microbe? And he goes into it, and it's a fungus. And I'm like, so you're selling a fungus packaged along with the fungicide? And he's like, oh, well, yeah, of course. I mean, that's just temporary as we perfect this process.
Right.
We're not going to need that. And later, I get back to my house, and I'm Googling this soil microbe, and it turns out to be this extremely common soil microbe that is, in a normal person's yard, much less in farms. And so they're selling this product with all of this rhetoric and BS around it that is essentially another way to move this chemical. And, to me, that in the end kind of said it all about the company. And something else that I should say is that Robert Fraley, I asked him point blank, are you guys, because at that time they were desperately trying to buy Syngenta, because Syngenta is a rival that has a decent seed portfolio, but what it's really known for is this vast pesticide portfolio. And it seemed like Monsanto, who had this big seed portfolio, but a relatively modest pesticide portfolio, was desperately trying to merge with Syngenta to get its hands on more pesticides. And I said, are you guys still trying to buy Syngenta? Oh, no, we decided to go it alone. Not long after, they made another aggressive push for Syngenta, so he totally bullshitted me on that. And then not long after that, the other, basically the same kind of deal happened, but from the other direction. And that is that Bayer, which is a company that has lots of pesticides and a modest seed portfolio, ended up buying Monsanto and creating this juggernaut that has, the biggest seed portfolio, and one of the two, I think, along with Syngenta, the biggest pesticide portfolio. So, Robert Fraley was totally snowing me the whole time.
Right. I mean, it's sort of well-trod ground, the abuses of big ag cartels. We're familiar with, the environmental consequences, or at least our listeners are. I'm kind of interested in hearing more about sort of the future of farming from a industrial standpoint. they might call it precision farming or digital farming. Some might call it farming without farmers. I mean, for a long time, for decades, it's been sort of this system of debt. Like a company like John Deere will sell you a bunch of equipment and you pay it off for the rest of your life. And increasingly, these are sophisticated machines that you can't even fix yourself. And so they're getting revenue from that. But eventually, are farmers just going away?
That appears to be the plan. It appears to be the plan that this sort of, I think industrial agriculture at its root is this sort of Enlightenment dream of rationalizing this very messy process. Mm-hmm. Like, farming, there's, it's hard to imagine a messier process in farming, literally dealing with dirt. Weather is a really big deal. Weather is unpredictable. Weather is getting less predictable because of climate change. And, or insofar as it is predictable, it's just getting worse. It's just getting harsher and harsher. And industrial agriculture wants to take that messiness away and make as many things as possible essentially automated and push button. And I think that is the vision. I mean, we've seen without really interruption, consolidation of farmland in the Corn Belt, fewer and fewer farms, but bigger and bigger farms. So, mid-sized farms continue to go out of business and get their land consolidated into larger operations. And so those forces are still at play, and precision agriculture offers the promise of continuing that process. So with Roundup Ready seeds and a big combine, a farmer who could maybe have effectively managed 500 acres on his own a couple of decades ago, let's say now can do 2,500 acres. But if you add just, very few decisions to be made, most things can be done with the push of a button, then maybe that goes up to 10,000 acres. And so it requires, the promise is requiring less and less human skill, human intervention. And, what these companies are doing is they're saying, hey, let us be your one-stop shop. Let us be your supermarket for seeds and chemicals. And I think that was the whole premise of the Bayer Monsanto deal is if you have all the pesticides and all the seeds, then you can tell farmers, don't go anywhere else. We'll be your Amazon. And also, you give us your data. So you, on your John Deere combine and tractor, will have these sensors. And these sensors will capture all kinds of data. We'll also have satellite data from your farm about like how green your field is. That can tell us about fertility. And do you need a little bit more fertilizer? Give us all your data and we will give you back recommendations that you can just follow. Spray this fungicide, spray this insecticide, use seeds treated with these chemicals. And we've got, we can create a custom seed coating for you for different parts of your field. And it's just essentially just sort of giving those companies all the power. And, there's various things you can do with that much data. You can trade off of it based on, it just opens opportunities for those companies. They can get a very early take before the USDA report comes on how corn yields are doing in the Midwest. They can trade on that in some cases. A company like Cargill, at least at one time, had a hedge fund. What's to stop some of these giant seed conglomerates from creating hedge funds or collaborating with them? But, the end game to that is fewer and fewer farmers doing more and more land with less and less people on the land. And all of the trends we've seen in the Midwest about, the small town drugstore closes, the grocery store closes, the school closes, and just the sort of rise of, things like as the economy declines, drug problems arise in their place, all of those dysfunctions that we've seen that have led to arguably a lot of xenophobia. I witnessed it myself in Iowa in a episode that I didn't end up putting in the book, but I met people on the ground in Iowa complaining bitterly about some of the depredations of industrial agriculture, like, all the giant trucks going through their community to pick up and drop off hogs and feed at these giant CAFOs, messing up the road, not having any responsibility for it, putting pollution in the air. But their answer isn't, let's crack down on industrial agriculture. Let's crack down on the immigrants working in the plant, working in the meat processing plant that it's the only economy happening in the area. Those workers are the problem, not the companies. And so you get this sort of, those forces of depopulating the town, making industrial agriculture the only game in town, that have caused a lot of political changes in our country are set to continue. And the end of the mid-sized diversified farmer who's got some cattle that go out into rotation, that have corn and soybeans, but also might have a third crop like rye and oats, that are making decisions based on the ecology of that piece of land. That becomes more and more rare. And I should add that I think that a lot of there's a danger that when you add like carbon markets to the system of ever increasing digital agriculture, you can get some real perverse incentives where farmers are being rewarded for activities like round or bloody no-till that doesn't sequester very much carbon, if any at all, but are getting carbon payments for it, and it's just building onto the system dominated by these giant companies. And meanwhile, the spring storms that I document in the book hitting bare soil because all they grow is corn and soybeans, and there's nothing buffering the soil in the winter or spring. Those erosion events just continue happening. Soil continues unraveling, and yet carbon payments are going to these giant farms.
Right. And I think that's something that's hard to understand, is the financialization of farming. And you alluded to it a few moments ago and just now. Talk a little bit more about that and how and why that's important to understand.
Yeah. So I think, there is this, in the financialization of everything that we've seen in the past 30 or 40 years, farmland has come into that maw. I think, at a pretty advanced phase in California, we've seen, basically for somebody to become a financial class, it has to have a story. So a financial class is something that a financial advisor will say, hey, if you want a diversified portfolio, you've got to have this in it. You've got to have stocks, you've got to have bonds, you got to have real estate. And farmland is emerging as something on that level. And the story behind it is that when you buy a piece of farmland, the value of it's probably going to rise. And we've seen a long-term trend of rising farmland values in the United States. So, you buy it and you hold it, and you're going to cash in when you sell it. And then not only does it appreciate in value, but it also throws off income. And so in California, if you have a crop like almonds that has this big expanding market, the rising middle class, Americans are eating more almonds, but we're not a big enough place to absorb all the production coming out of California. They need growing foreign markets. And so the growing middle classes of Asia are, eating more luxury products like almonds, and the industry is very deftly marketing them to consumers in Asia and also Europe. And so you're getting this rising almond consumption that you can tell for an investor, it's like, I've got this rising market. I know almond prices aren't going to go down. They're probably going to go up, and I can make income every year, sort of like dividends on a stock, and I can cash in when I sell it. It's a great thing. And so, I talk about in the book, this, push of hedge funds and big insurance companies investing in California farmland. And you also see it in the Midwest. And where you're really seeing it now is an area I didn't get to in the book, and that is the delta of the southern United States. The Mississippi Delta states are coming under a lot of scrutiny by investors as a great place to grow food. You can grow corn and soybeans if that makes sense. You can grow cotton if that makes sense. You can do sort of industrial scale vegetable production. If that makes sense, it's a little bit more versatile than the Corn Belt. And so we're seeing hedge funds, and Bill Gates recently has been buying a lot of farmland in the Delta. And what these kind of investors, their time horizon is, it isn't super short term, but it's also like 20 years maybe. If, that would be a long time horizon for one of these investors. It isn't future generations. So they have different incentives. If you buy some California land, you just want there to be enough, at least an illusion of enough water to sell it at a nice price in 20 years. And meanwhile, wring all the water out of it you can. And so you get, people with a lot more short-term incentives on how that land is used than you get when there are cooperatives or individual people owning land. And I think we're going to see that more and more as, the U.S. investor class goes looking for hedges against inflation, for stability, for just a place to park money where there's a good chance of appreciation and annual income.
The underlying ethos now, it seems, of these large corporate entities that control a lot of agriculture is that the problems are too big, climate change with soil degradation. We really need large scale changes and shifts, and we can manage that for you. We can do that for you. We have the apparatus to implement this stuff. We have the ability to move farmers off the land and to do it more efficiently. That's sort of the sales pitch, is that we can do this better than anyone else because we have the data, we have the tech. And yet you see people who are rising up against that, particularly in India right now, with the protests that are going on there. And it seems to be sort of a statement about the value of indigenous ways of knowing when it comes to growing food. And, with what we're seeing with COVID and the precarity of the food system, it seems incredibly dangerous to me to consolidate power in the hands of a few and to disempower people from basic skills like growing their own food.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think that, COVID is a great example. And another one is, just that, complete chaos unleashed on Texas with these, anomalous snowstorms and winter weather events causing grids to crash. That plus terrible policy in Texas causing grids to crash and supply chains to snarl up. And it just shows, I think that we have for a century, at least a century, we have moved our food system. We've sort of used it to maximize efficiency. The idea was, a giant slaughterhouse is great because you can get a bunch of people in there to work on the line and get a bunch of technology like, spraying, sprays of essentially bleach onto the meat to sterilize things. We can produce a whole lot of meat really fast and really cheaply. And hey, if we use undocumented, essentially disenfranchised workers, then we can pay them less, and that just adds to the efficiency. But we see that throughout the food chain of just this sort of fixation on efficiency. And I think that efficiency is great, but you've got to balance it with robustness and resiliency. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have to, these events like COVID-19, like the Texas storm, remind us of the importance of building redundancy into the system, that, sacrificing a little bit of efficiency. Like if you had smaller meat packing plants with fewer workers where the line speed is moving more slowly, then you wouldn't have to sacrifice, 300, I forget the latest numbers, but, 300 plus human lives to keep our meat system flowing during the COVID-19 pandemic. You could probably create safe social distance conditions in those plants. They would be less efficient, but they would be more resilient to a shock like COVID-19. And I think, similar things with the economic shocks to come. And, in my book, I have a chapter about an event that's pretty likely to happen. And that is the Central Valley that we were just talking about. The flip side of drought is massive flood. And the same forces that make the winter storms, less frequent in California also makes them more powerful. And, there's a pretty high likelihood of a storm coming in the next 20 or 30 years that could well put the entire Central Valley under 30 feet of water. And I was thinking about that during the Texas disasters of last week, basically just the thin, society does hang on this very thin thread now of power grids. Well, something like that would wipe out power grids for millions and millions and millions of people. And it would happen, just the damage there is really hard to fathom, the human cost of it. But we also have to think about it is our sort of fruit and vegetable basket. And it would just completely throw our food system way off course if this disaster were to happen. And we would be a lot more resilient and robust if we could build up fruit and vegetable production in many other places, a lot in the United States, a lot more than it is now. And California would be less important. And I think that would be really smart. But just an example of, leaning on California is very efficient, but it doesn't make us very resilient.
Right. And you talk about that in the book, this philosophy of specialization, the idea that a region should focus in not necessarily on feeding itself, but on getting really good at producing 1, 2, or 3 things and then exporting those goods. You offer a critique of that in the book. Talk more about what you were just alluding to, which is sort of the building up of redundancies and resilience through, regional food hubs.
Yeah. So, there's this idea of comparative advantage. And, I hauled this economist out for a bit of a beating in my book for saying, hey, this is like maybe 2000, sometime in the 2000s, this economist who was writing on Freakonomics blog was, basically like, what is all this nonsense about local and regional food production? Haven't these people heard of California? California's got this great natural advantage in growing food. It's got this great Mediterranean climate. He didn't mention it, but California's always benefited from proximity to Mexico and the fact that it used to be Mexico. So it's got this, this essentially captive workforce that works really cheap, although that is starting to change, as I talked about earlier. It's got the Sierra Nevada snowpack. We should be growing most of our fruits and vegetables in California, and other regions should be doing something different. And I think he actually wrote that in 2011. And that very year is when California goes into this massive drought. And it just made me reflect about how I think there is something to comparative advantage. It's not a stupid idea, but there's a lot of false economies within it. Like California has much less of a comparative advantage when you factor in the fact that it's drawing down its water supply in this catastrophic way. And when you put that into it, and then you also add this flooding factor, which I don't think very many people were thinking about in 2011, its comparative advantage starts to look a little bit different. And it starts to, even within that logical framework, it starts to make a lot more sense to build redundancy into the system, because the very non-zero chance of decline and or interruption of that resource. And I think that it's incumbent on us as writers and economists and just thinkers in general to, when we're thinking through those things, asking, what are the real advantages of a given area? And what am I not seeing? Like this, maybe this is too good to be true. And I think that particular economist fell into that trap. But I just think, California, with its incredible natural advantages that I've laid out, should be a great will always be, as long as we exist as a society and a species, a great place to grow food. It should overproduce food for its own population and be a regional food provider for the Southwest or for the West Coast. But I think we should de-emphasize it as the national source of food. And just, as I put it, de-Californify. In Texas and Colorado, in the Northeast, in the Southeast, and other parts of the country, there's been this great movement of small scale and medium scale farmers, but it's still relatively small. California still dominates the food chain. And I think we should, as a national policy and as local and regional policies, we should set ourselves to increasing that, finding out what do farmers need, what sort of land policies, how can we tweak land policies to make farming more profitable? What sort of infrastructure gaps exist at local and regional levels that we can make public investments in to increase regional food production? And if we do that, then if the California aquifer, dries up, or the state gets swamped under a huge flood or a giant earthquake, that could be a local problem, and resources can flow to help fixing it, but it doesn't have to cause these ripple effects nationwide. And so that's sort of what I'd like to see.
Chris Newman, who's a farmer in Virginia, has written a lot about sort of the pitfalls of the small farmer ideal.
Yeah.
And how it's likely not going to mount an effective defense against big ag. I'm curious to see what you think about Newman's ideas, but I think you're familiar with him. And and also sort of how that fits into maybe your own vision for how small farmers can sort of unite and find some collective power there.
Yeah, so I finished my book before I was reading Chris, but I think the ideas in my last couple of sections of Perilous Bounty and his ideas aren't in contradiction. Mm-hmm. And we're both sort of saying similar things from a different direction. And that is that, basically I asked a question of, I used sort of the publication of Omnivore's Dilemma in 2006 as a landmark. So there was enough energy in the movement to pull Pollen into writing this book. And then, so already by 2006, we were well into this rise of farmers markets and CSAs. And he writes this book and really popularizes the idea. And I feel like, around that time, there was just a lot of despair over national politics, the Iraq War and second election of George W. Bush. And there's a lot of despair over national politics. And I think that book lands at a time when people are ready to think about something else and turn their vision, in a more local direction. And so you get this other big burst of interest in local food and farmers markets and farm-to-table restaurants, and all that takes off. And I was part of that. I started working on a small scale farm in 2004. So I was part of that movement. But I ask at the end of my book, which was written in this section was written in late 2019, what have we really gained in that 15 years since? Or if you want to go back to the 70s and Wendelberger, or, wherever you want to start, when did the local food movement start? What have we gotten in terms of tamping down and replacing the power of industrial agriculture and industrial food and stopping its ecological damages? And the answer was not very far. And so this model that I was part of, that we've all, Acres has been part of, it has really shown its limits. And so my answer is, I guess I just kind of outlined it. It's sort of like, figuring out this is a public problem. This is a societal problem. And we spend let's say $5 to $25 billion a year and more in recent years on farm programs. We are pumping public money into the ag system what if we use that money in other ways? Like, what if we asked fundamental questions about what kind of food system we wanted and put public resources behind them? And so I think that's sort of my answer. And Chris asks very provocative questions about the sort of single farmer model, and wants to push over to an idea of, essentially indigenous ways of land stewardship that I think in the Western context, the starting point is cooperatives and webs of cooperatives. And I think that these two ideas are very compatible. Like, those cooperatives take resources. And I think the biggest resource, and I think Chris would agree with this, that's lacking is farmland being or land in general being so expensive. And there's got to be some ways around, ways that we can figure out how to make land, like if you want to farm and make money selling fruits and vegetables and make a decent living, then you probably want to be near some kind of urban center, because that's where, prosperous consumers who can afford, well-grown fruits and vegetables live. There's population density. But paradoxically, land outside of those areas is very expensive. Like, if you want to tap the New York City market, you're competing with a hedge fund guy who wants to put his second home on your, Hudson Valley dream farm. And that's dramatically drives up the cost of that farmland. And, that's true everywhere. It's true in Austin, every place I've been. Now I'm living in North Carolina. It's really the best markets for local food are places like Asheville and the Research Triangle of Raleigh-Durham. And those are also places where land is most expensive. And so figuring out land use policies and creating support for new cooperatives, I think this is where the real cutting edge of thought, I think, it has to be. And it's sort of, my book ends at the edge of that. And I think there are multiple other books to be written about how to develop a system that actually makes sense. But I think a lot of people's ideological priors will have to get shaken up about, just things like, what does land ownership mean in the United States?
Yeah.
This is essentially settler colonial way of thinking about it, that, I as an individual get a deed to this piece of land and I can pass it on to my heirs or sell it to the market. Is that really compatible with creating a sustainable food system? I think Chris is asking really provocative questions along those lines.
Yeah. Well, Tom, do you have any hope for the current presidential administration and Congress to make changes to agricultural policy that will line up with your prescriptions, or are you seeing sort of more of the same old trends continue?
I see a lot of hope and also a lot of peril. Like a lot of people, I was really disappointed by the choosing of Tom Vilsack to run the USDA, which he had ran for the 8 years under the Obama administration, and was basically a centrist corporate Democrat, and ran the department like that. And you can Google my name and his name and see some critiques. I've been writing about Vilsack since 2008, but I wrote some stuff about him around the time of his nomination. And so I see that as definitely a sign that Biden, on other picks that he's done, he's shown an ability to grow past the sort of centrist corporate Democrat place that he came from and that he occupied under Obama. But in ag, he went, took a sharp turn backwards. But I think he and Vilsack were probably surprised by the reception that, very few people outside of ag commodity groups like, the Farm Bureau or the National Corn Growers were excited about it. There's a lot of pushback. So I think Vilsack is starting off a little bit on his back heel and, kind of forced into a position of wanting to show progressives that, hey, I changed with the times. So I take some hope in that. But where I'm really getting hope nowadays is, essentially Cory Booker, who used to be sort of the personification of the centrist corporate Democrat, has really been putting forward some impressive ag policy bills in the past couple of years. He's got an incredible bill that would essentially phase out over time confined animal feedlot operations, the giant factory hog and chicken and farms and beef feedlots. Really crack down on them and phase them out in a way that would be fair to the farmers now holding the bag for them. He's got an incredible Justice for Black Farmers Act that would, redress some really stark wrongs done to Black farmers over the past century. And he's got a climate bill that I think has some potential that focuses on ag. And the exciting thing about him is that he joined the Senate Ag Committee. He is now, the senator from New Jersey is now in the Senate Ag Committee. This was not a sexy committee to be on for ambitious politicians from urban areas in recent years, and he's going in full-throated with a lot of policy ideas. Senator Warnock, who recently won election in Georgia, joined him on the Senate Ag Committee, and so now we have our second and third Black senators on the committee ever. And Warnock seems to, he's from Atlanta, another urban guy, seems to have some very progressive ag policy. And I know it might sound crazy to listeners, like, how are we praising this guy from Jersey? How is he going to tell us about ag policy? But I can tell you that that Booker has been working really hard with Joe Maxwell, who used to be with the Organization for Competitive Markets, which seeks to rein in the power of these giant corporations that run the food system. And Joe is now doing a thing called Family Farm Action. Joe's a Missouri guy who grew up in a hog farm. He's sort of a good progressive populist. And Cory Booker's staff has been working really hard with groups like that. So it isn't coming from a place of ignorance, like, hey, we know how to do agriculture here in New York, and we're going to impose it on you out in rural America. It's very nuanced. It's very tied into progressive social movements in farm country. So I'm excited about that. I haven't seen a real progressive force within the committee in the Senate in a while. And on the House side, for 15 years, the top Democrat on the House Ag Committee was Cullen Peterson. Cullen Peterson is essentially a climate change denier and a champion of these agribusiness companies. He was defeated in his race, booted out of the House by the election. And there is this Representative Scott from Georgia, also an African-American man who's been on the committee for a while. I don't know much about him yet. I do think he's got some agribusiness interests. If you're from Georgia, you probably do. But he does not deny climate change. And he has been talking about it a lot since he took over. And I think that's very encouraging to go from a climate denier to someone who's determined to have an adult conversation about it as it pounds farm country across the country. So I'm encouraged by that. And I'm encouraged by social movements like, the climate movement has come up and already had a big impact. It's, stopped the Keystone Pipeline a couple of times. And I think the climate movement is getting more sophisticated about food, and the food movement is getting more sophisticated about climate. And I would like to see them come together and basically fuse, because it's really the same question. How do we keep ourselves going? How do we transition away from fossil fuels? How do we keep the food supply going despite these inevitable weather shocks? Even if we stop using fossil fuels, we still are dealing with climate chaos. And I think that in Washington, we have people on the ground who are listening to social movements in a way that we didn't have 10 years ago. And really, that's where I take my hope.
Well, Tom, thanks so much for your insight, and congratulations on the book.
Well, thank you so much for having me and asking me such smart questions.
There you have it. Go buy Perilous Bounty at the acresusa.com bookstore. Use the coupon code FEBPOD, that's FEBPOD, for 10% off on all titles. To find out more about Tom Philpott, visit www.tomphilpott.net. Thank you for listening to another episode of Tractor Time, brought to you by Acres USA and Barn to Door. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube, iTunes, or anywhere podcasts are available. Also find us at acresusa.com, ecofarmingdaily.com, and don't forget to subscribe to our monthly magazine. Thanks again for listening and have a great week.